Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our panel on generative AI, breakthrough research, and limitations. I'll be one of your moderators. My name is Adam Landman. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Mass General Brigham, and I'm joined by...
Hey, I'm Alec Stranahan. I do SMid-Biotech research at Bank of America, PhD in oncology, and I've been at the bank for about 7 years.
Alec and I wanted to just take a moment and set the stage for this morning's panel. And we wanted to briefly remind everyone that there are two broad categories of artificial intelligence, analytical AI and generative AI. Analytical AI, which includes machine learning, has been around for over 30 years, so we have lots of experience with it. And with analytical AI, we use large data sets and generate algorithms that can help identify patterns and also make predictions and decisions. So an example might be an algorithm to predict the length of stay of a patient that's being admitted to the hospital, or an algorithm that might look at colonoscopy images and identify potential polyps for a gastroenterologist. Generative AI really has only been around for about 4 years, and over the last 2 years has really gained significant acceleration and traction. And so unlike analytical AI, generative AI generates net new content. So it can generate text, images, music, even computer code. And it does this based on patterns it's learning from massive, enormous data sets. Many of you may be familiar with large language models, such as GPT or Gemini. These are examples of generative AI. And in these examples, in large language models, you can actually have a conversation with the AI, and as responses, it can summarize information and generate new responses to your question. This morning's panel is going to focus on the latter. It's going to focus on generative AI. So unless you hear from one of the moderators or panelists, otherwise, we are focused on generative AI. And we are really fortunate to have an exceptional panel here today that's really going to explore how we can drive research, innovation, and ultimately adoption of generative AI in healthcare. And we're going to focus in sort of 4 areas. First, we're going to hear about potential novel breakthroughs with generative AI. Then we'll talk a little bit about ways that we can advance generative AI and accelerate it. We'll talk a little bit about what it will take to scale. What are some of the challenges, including regulation? And finally, we'll hear some predictions for the future. But without further ado, let's meet the panel. So I'm going to ask each panelist to kind of very briefly introduce themselves and also give us an indication of, are they bullish or optimistic for generative AI in healthcare, or bearish or pessimistic? So we'll start with Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Andriole, and I have a background in biomedical and electrical engineering and medicine. I studied classical machine learning last century, and then I got involved in implementing informatics technologies into clinical practice. I've now come full circle back to AI with a focus on clinical translation, and I'm in the Department of Radiology at the Brigham and also the Director of Academic Research and Education at Mass General Brigham AI, and I am cautiously bullish.
Hi everyone, I'm Faisal Mahmood. I run a computational pathology research group at Mass General Brigham. We're about 30 people, a mixture of grad students, postdocs, with a variety of different backgrounds, including computer science, pathology, and biomedical engineering. And I'm very optimistic about generative AI.
My name is David Blumenthal. I'm a primary care physician by training, spent most of my professional career at Mass General Hospital. But I have a deep interest in health policy. I've worked in government. And that's been the perspective I've been bringing to generative AI. I am quite optimistic about AI, but I think it will disappoint us in the short term.
Hopefully not me then. All right, so we're going to keep on running with the bull. Definitely bullish. So Will Morris, I'm an internist as well, and am the Chief Medical Information Officer at Google, primarily focused on Google Cloud and partnering with cloud servers across healthcare and life science.
Perfect. Well, good to see the optimism on the panel, and it looks like given the full room, there's certainly a lot of optimism, or at least interest in generative AI within healthcare here in the room. So there are a couple of seats here, but it should be a good panel. I guess first, maybe just to kick things off, Adam, I think, gave a good setup on a few of the different applications that are being considered within the two verticals of AI, but maybe for the panel, what excites you most currently in any upcoming breakthroughs in generative AI that may solve healthcare challenges? And if you can give maybe one example of an area like drug development or diagnostics that you think will be biggest impacted, maybe starting with Kathy.
Sure. I'm really excited about the concept of multimodal prognostication. So that is, so I've been involved a lot in analytic AI, and we're doing sort of one-trick ponies, looking at images and looking for one finding. I think with generative AI, we have the ability to search tremendous amounts of data and provide that information to a clinician that maybe they don't have at the time of clinical decision making. And that can be done using these techniques, using text, labs, images, pathology data, so on and so forth. So I think prognostication, and then the other thing from a workflow efficiency is quantitation of things. Coming from the radiology space, this is a difficult and time-consuming thing to do, and we can do this using AI much, much more efficiently and accurately.
So my group has done quite a lot of work recently in generative AI for pathology, and most of the work that we have done and other people have done in other areas can be categorized in two different subtypes, I would say. So what the first subtype would be around discovery, and the other one is around more clinically oriented tasks, such as prediction of diagnosis, writing reports, or other generative tasks that would be useful in medicine. So we developed a chatbot recently. We're calling it Path Chat, where we can give it a pathology image and then start communicating with the chatbot about the image. In context, it can take lots of pathology images. So during the diagnostic process, it could read multiple pathology images, essentially order additional tests on its own, and then ingest that information within the same context and produce a report before a pathologist would look at it. On the discovery side, what I'm really excited about is that throughout the history of medicine, the way new features or new diseases, anything new has been discovered, is that someone goes in, looks at lots and lots of data, correlates it with outcome manually, and says, well, this is a new subtype, this is a new disease. We have the ability for the first time to do that computationally on its own with large amounts of healthcare data that's being continuously collected. So large amounts of patient data, what's common across those patients, what features are common, and then correlating that with outcome on its own using generative models.
All right. So what gets me most excited about generative AI is not actually generative AI. It's a tool, but it's looking for the right problem. And I'm most excited about actually the platforms around these. There's not going to be one magical model that rules them all. There's going to be a constant battle of whack-a-mole with models, and it's really important to have a core scalable platform. So to me, at least the responsibility for those on the tech side is providing these solutions to where work is performed, whether it be a hospital or researcher. Google's never going to get into the medical practice. We're never going to buy a EHR or get into that space, but we are always going to be in support of other researchers, other capabilities. So whether it be open source or building a platform that is agnostic to, perhaps the model or a competitor. I think that's number one. Number two is definitely security, and we'll probably touch upon data privacy and security, but that is probably job number one, is not to promulgate and increase the liability, the risk, and the concerns for exfiltration of data, or certainly open up vulnerabilities, because we all know, what just happened, several instances over the past year. And then the third, I think, is, these are powerful tools and the appropriate frameworks around these. Not the sexiest thing to talk about, right? You wouldn't necessarily say regulation is something to be excited, but I think the responsibility for us all is to do AI and generative AI in a self-conscious, ethical framework, and this is the brave new world. The science, the computer science that's going on is absolutely mind-boggling, and I am not a developer. But the core capabilities that are being developed are growing at such a space that it really is important for us to all think and get excited about kind of the frameworks and controls around these powerful tools.
So if I could just add another distinction here for our conversation. We've heard the distinction made between predictive AI and generative AI. Within the category of generative AI, I think there's another important distinction to be made, and that is between its use by clinicians in the care of patients and its use by patients and consumers in their daily lives. I've been thinking about the regulation of clinical AI that is used by clinicians, but also about the regulation of AI in the hands of consumers. I actually think that some of the most important and powerful uses are going to be by consumers and patients. And those might happen sooner and with less initial controls than will be true of clinicians. Whether people, individuals, will pay for those is another thing altogether. Much more likely to be paid for by clinical enterprises. So keep your eyes, keep those distinctions in mind as we talk. I'm going to be mostly talking today, when I do, about regulation of the clinical side, which I think is a little easier to predict than the consumer side.
You've all painted pretty exciting examples of how Gen AI is going to really transform the practice of medicine for both clinicians as well as patients and family members. What I want to focus now, let's try to go a little deeper, building on all of your comments, and talk a little bit about what sort of resources and tools we need to accelerate innovation in AI. And Faisal, maybe we can pick up and go a little deeper. You've created really a groundbreaking innovation with PathChat, right? Your research has shown that the models that you've developed are scoring better with diagnosis. They're able to answer general questions. How do we not only continue to accelerate your work, but enable others to create similar products for other fields?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my opinion, there are three key components. And the three key components are data, compute, and personnel. To build like a high-powered team that can build generative AI or any AI models that would be effective. So you need lots of data, and often the data that's clinically available is not enough for generative AI. And let me give an example. So clinically, we have pathology glass slides which can be digitized, and pathology reports. But to build a pathology-specific chatbot, you need lots of annotated data at the fine, granular, different magnifications within every pathology image. And every pathology image is more like a satellite image. It's hierarchical, has information at different scales. So a lot of manual data curation was required to build a chatbot that can cater to all of pathology. So quite often the data that you need might not be clinically available particularly for generative AI. And I mean, we hope that eventually we would have generative AI writing pathology reports where there would be a very detailed morphologic description of the image leading to a diagnosis, so it can also reason about it. And that's not how things are currently done. Also, general questions that people might ask that data doesn't clinically exist. So lots of data collection. The compute component is very difficult to solve because it keeps scaling. There's a new generation of GPUs coming out every year. It's very difficult to for us to keep up in like an academic setting, but we're trying to do our best. Of course, there's a lot of government support for these, like programs from ARPA and so forth that we're plugged into. And then the personnel piece, in our case, we're obviously blessed with lots of Harvard and MIT graduate students and great postdocs and great clinical trainees at MGB, but really good personnel working to bring all of that together. So that's my opinion on that.
Excellent. I wonder, Kathy, given the novel work that your team is doing in radiology, are you facing similar needs, and especially on the data side?
Yes, I think we do need more medical data, specifically medical data, to train these models on. And I also think we need an infrastructure in which to clinically validate these tools. We've developed a shadow mode infrastructure, if you will, where we can test in the true clinical environment without impacting the clinical decision making. So it's kind of behind the scenes before we put things in clinically. So I think that's difficult to scale, and not every place can necessarily do that. So we do need help from industry in creating these tools. And I would second Faisal's, Dr. Mahmood's comment about personnel. I think it's a team sport. We need data scientists, absolutely, but we also need clinicians involved to make sure that we are addressing the most important and clinically relevant problems. And also implementation scientists, because I think we're not quite there. We have some standards that we can implement things into the point of care, but for these to really be used, it has to be done in an appropriate way, much like, I'm not a gamer, but they have wonderful user interfaces. Why don't we have that in medicine? And I think that's a technology solution that we can solve with our industry partners.
All right, before we go to Will, I want to ask you one other question, just knowing that you have trained a whole generation of informaticists in radiology and in general clinical informatics. What do you think physicians and others need for education as we go forward in AI?
Yep. I started when I was 12, so let's just get that clear. I think medical education is fundamentally going to change, and we are going to require data science understanding enough so that people understand the limitations and can assess when a tool goes wrong and what tools to implement. So I think medical education will change. And we've done this with the informatics side. We had 1 or 2 per year, and then it started showing up on the boards and people started studying it. So I think it's very, very important that we educate, and I think that's a gap right now. But we do have interest and excitement on the student and trainee side. So I don't think that's going to be the issue, but we need more training.
Thank you. All right, Will, there's big expectations here on how industry, particularly the big hyperscalers, could potentially help here on the data side, on the compute side, and even providing additional infrastructure. What are your thoughts for some of the opportunities?
Yeah, I think it's a couple things. So, at least within Alphabet, we are putting $50 billion a year into the core infrastructure, right? Trying to keep up with the latest GPUs, because these things are unbelievably not the most scalable thing when you talk about the transformer architect. That's the T. That's kind of the backbone of the data architecture for generative AI. And so, a commitment for us is this is the core bet, whether it's developing our own first-party models and doing AlphaFold and stuff out of DeepMind, or working with other companies providing that as the back end, right? Empowering other academic medical centers or health systems through an infrastructure. I think that's kind of number one investment. 2 is contributing to open source and open standards. I think is really, really important. A rising tide raises all boats for all of us. And so ensuring that researchers, developers have access to great tooling so they can do that last mile is really, really important. And then 3, we talked about kind of the security of these things and the provisions around it. Like MGB, we are a founding member with Chai, which is responsible AI. Again, building out these frameworks. So we have something that is like nuclear fission, or fusion rather. Really, really powerful experience, but we don't want something that's explosive.
Oh, thank you. I think one common element here is that it's going to take funding to facilitate and really accelerate all this, right? From funding people, from funding training, and then for funding the infrastructure. David, you're in kind of a unique position, being a very accomplished researcher who has secured funding, but also been on the side of leading a foundation that has distributed funds. Do you have thoughts on, as we go forward and want to accelerate the safe, effective, trustworthy use of AI, how we might best fund it?
Well, first, I think it's really important to realize that the foundational knowledge we need to create trust in this technology does not exist. we don't have metrics to measure performance. How many hallucinations per prompt is sufficient or too many? How many errors? How much reliability? How do we create comparative performance standards against which the creators and developers can compete, and which users can reference in order to know how reliable and trustworthy the tools they're using will be? And the same will be true for the consumer reports that rates this for consumers. So we need a foundational science to rate the quality of generative AI models in performance in healthcare, not in general, but in healthcare. The path, so that's a funding issue, and it's a public good. It is fundamentally a responsibility of government, NIH, ARPA-H, NSF, and philanthropy, but much less philanthropy because the investment is so large. And it will come down to the National Institutes of Standards and Technology to begin leading the process of consensus development about the right standards. Once we have standards, we can begin to develop performance metrics and measures. It's going to be very important that they be transparent. I think that's going to ultimately be a governmental responsibility to set a baseline for required transparency so that all actors will compete on a level playing field. And we will also need a platform for privacy performance as well. And we are woefully behind in protecting the privacy of information that people will trust, clinicians will trust, and patients will trust that when they put their private information into large language models, that it's not going to be used to market to them or others some product that they don't want to hear about or buy. So a lot of work to be done. That's one of the reasons why I think we're going to see a slowing of the return on these products in the short term. But once we have that foundation in place, things can move very quickly.
David, you may have unintentionally segued into my next line of questions, which is on ethics and privacy with AI. And I think, Will, you actually mentioned something up front that I wanted to elevate a little bit, which is AI is a tool, and it's up to us to use it responsibly to benefit humanity, which I think is, it should be core of any decision-making that's being done in AI broadly, but even more so within healthcare when patients are involved. So, Will, maybe starting with you, coming from sort of the Google perspective, any ethical concerns around generative AI in healthcare, bias, privacy, and how should these concerns be addressed?
No, none. Wow, talk about a tough question. No, certainly. I mean, it's a tool, not the rule. I mean, the most amazing thing about the generative AI is that it's almost anthropomorphic. It actually feels human, right? There's a reason why if you use one of the public ones, it types out one word at a time, as if there's some mechanical Turk behind it, but it's not. It actually knows the whole sentence, right? That to me is actually, we're going back. I mean, it needs to be really, really, well established that it's not magic, it's math, it's probability. I say a sentence, the boy on a bike fell off and began to, cry, right? It's a probability of the next word. Adam might think bleed or something else, but it is all probabilistic math, and so there's an inherent hallucination, right? There's people say hallucination is a feature, not a failure. So there is some inherent things, but grounding in some of the science behind the scenes is really, really important. I think the ethical considerations are, we obviously publish our guidelines around safe and ethical use of it in a non-discriminatory manner, and we participate in a lot of the work that David does as well, because I think it's really important to get this right, because getting it wrong, especially in clinical practice, we know one bad incidence is one too many. So I think the three things that folks in the audience can do is, number one is to be educated. Like it or not, this is the brave new world, and so you need not to be a computer scientist, but you should really understand kind of the limits, the pros and cons. Again, it is not magic. It is math, and so you really kind of have to understand that. Two is, I think workflow is king or queen. It's great to have technology, but if it's done to you, it's done to you. It needs to be done with you, and so that's why I think the clinicians, whether it be a researcher or a bedside physician, has to be in the conversation early, because actually that's the only way you get value, right? Otherwise, you just introduce technology and you cost $1, but you didn't realize any return. And then the three is you share. I mean, I think these kind of collaborations, because it is a little bit of a brave new world. Again, we're a tech company. We're never going to get into the provisions of healthcare. We come really, really close to it. And so this is where kind of the true partnerships kind of, work, whether it be Mass General Brigham or others. But I think those are the kind of, at least the three things that keep us on the straight and narrow.
That's great. And Kathy, I know you've published a considerable amount of work around this area. But in your view, what are sort of the ethical implications of adopting AI in healthcare, and how do we balance the need for large data sets with patient privacy?
Well, I think that's very important. Just to follow up on previous comments, I think one of my concerns is, how do we know when it's wrong? So we can have outrageous hallucinations, but often it's a very plausible. The cat ran after the mouse, or the dog ran after the mailman, car, ball. All of them are plausible. One is correct. It's not magic, it's math. So how do you know when it goes wrong? But patient privacy is very important. I think we can borrow from other fields that have valuable information that can be encrypted. We can train models using things like federated learning, where our data isn't going outside our walls, but we're sending the weights of a model to train in the analytic sessions, in the analytic type. So I think there are things we absolutely have to protect patient privacy. But it's interesting, a lot of patients are amenable to their data being used. So we have to use best practices. Often healthcare is slow to adopt some of these best data practices, and I think we can borrow from other industries in that regard.
That's helpful. And David, you recently published sort of a framework around how we could approach AI in healthcare from a regulatory perspective. How should health systems like MGB and external stakeholders, including the FDA, approach AI governance to ensure responsible use?
Well, it's a very big question, and I think the point you wanted me to expand on is the following. The pathway to the full benefits of generative AI and also predictive AI lies through creating trust. Trust about privacy, trust about performance, and trust about avoiding abuse and malevolence. Unfortunately, you can't totally count on individual operators to be trustworthy. And the most high-minded of them are at the mercy of the least high-minded, because it's the bad apple in the bunch that brings regulatory terror down on the industry. I think there will need to be some regulation of the generative AI that clinicians use, and I think clinicians will welcome it. I can't imagine, having been a primary care physician for 35 years, prescribing drugs without the FDA's guidance and guardrails, or using devices without the similar level of guarantees that FDA has provided. And I think if I were still in practice and wanting to direct my patients toward the use of a generative AI model, I would want an FDA-like standard of performance. Now, what should that be like? First, I would point out that current authorities that the federal government and state governments have do not apply to generative AI for a variety of reasons. generative AI is, we think of it as a device, but I think it defies categorization as a medical device because it can do anything. You can put it out as a way of organizing your itinerary for vacation, and it still performs as a healthcare device. So, and it's impractical to evaluate it from a pre-market standpoint for all its potential clinical uses. I think it's much more interesting to think about it as a novel form of intelligence with applications to healthcare. Now, that is probably a little bit ambitious for the current state of the technology, but not totally overstated for where it may be in 5 years. And if we look at it that way, then the question is, can you regulate intelligence? That may sound really bizarre, but let's do a thought experiment here, one worthy of Einstein. Would you trust Einstein to do brain surgery? Of course you wouldn't. First you'd want to know, has he gone to medical school? Has he had a residency? Has he had a fellowship? Has he been board certified in neurosurgery? You want to know all those things. And then you'd also want to know that if he got too caught up in relativity theory, so that he stopped learning about neurosurgery and stopped practicing neurosurgery, that he was no longer allowed to do it. They would lose his license. So that framework for intelligence perfection in application to use in clinical care is one that we might want to pay attention to for generative AI. Can we train it? Can we apprentice it? Can we test it? This is where the performance metrics become so important. Relevant performance metrics, not just whether they pass the boards or the licensing exams. Supervised application, the way I did a residency and the other clinicians here on the panel did a residency. And then continuous monitoring and retesting. I think that's one way of thinking about it for trust creation. And it would benefit very much from a collaborative development of the process and standards for how that would work.
I'm curious if others on the panel have reactions to this. Like Faisal, like take the incredible innovation of PathChat and now the framework that David just proposed. How would that work for you?
So, in my opinion, the key difference is that conventional machine learning is more deterministic. So if you train it A versus B or an n-class classification problem, it would always produce an answer from within those n classes. Whereas generative AI, it could be prompted to respond to, in theory, everything, right? So if you train a model, lots of pathology data, and later and someone comes up with a smart prompt that could try to identify the patient or the location of the patient, that would be possible. So the first thing for us was that we should have some guardrails built in. That's it's the incredibly fundamental protection that you can build in. Just guardrails. What should we let users do, and what should we stop users from doing? The other aspect of this is around hallucinations. So even though it's a generative model, a lot of generative models in healthcare are still expected to make deterministic responses, like what is the diagnosis and can you explain it and can you write a report? So one way to solve that problem is that you can have a combination of more deterministic conventional machine learning models working together or hand in hand with generative models. So the generative part is explaining and generating around the more deterministic model. So that model works quite well for constrained problems like diagnosis plus write a report, or diagnosis, what's the best form of treatment. But as David mentioned, we need a lot of research into figuring out what the best combinations are here, a lot of fundamental theoretical research to see how we can constrain these models from generating certain kinds of responses. In the back end, it's all deep learning, so the feature representations are largely abstract. So we don't even understand what feature representations the model is essentially using. So those features remain a black box, and there's ongoing work, lots of research being done trying to identify what those features might be. And once you begin to understand those, it will be more easier to constrain them.
I just want to point out that there is a difference from a policy standpoint between deterministic AI, analytic AI, and generative AI. if Faisal has developed a tool for interpreting pathology results and sells it as that, the FDA can first of all classify it as a medical device and regulate it as software as a medical device and demand evidence that it performs according to the standards that it ought to for such a device. That is a wholly different situation from generative AI, which has no advertised purpose. It is simply there to use for information, uncategorized information. As a matter of fact, it would be silly for Google to advertise generative AI as a medical device, because then it could be regulated. And why would they want to be regulated under FDA criteria? They would then have to go ahead and show for every possible utilization.
And think about all of those cat videos.
Yeah. So it is not a medical device. It is a source of information and needs to be thought about in that way. And then the question is, does it merit controls as a source of information? And I would argue that it's useful for clinicians using it to have the guidance that regulation provides.
It's a thoughtful, really thoughtful analogy, because when we think of clinicians, right, we can't control clinicians. We're not going to behave the exact same way every time, even though many would like to. We do this through order entry systems, clinical decision support, trying to influence clinicians, but we can't control them. So I really love how you've drawn this parallel to how we train, how we certify, and how we monitor clinicians. I think now the trick will be, can we figure out how to implement that or something similar going forward? We're going to open it up to questions in a second. So if the audience, if you have questions, I'd ask you, please think about them. I want to turn one question to Will, because I think he has an interesting vantage point, right? Will is an expert in healthcare and healthcare delivery, but now working for a technology company. And I'm curious if you can share, how is Google thinking about technology? Like, are you empowered with AI, generative AI tools on a day-to-day basis? What have you guys implemented?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert. That was your own hallucination right there. So just saying. Yeah, I mean, I think, we use it every day. Search, everyone kind of associates Google with search, but that's the cornerstone of what we do, and that's actually generative AI, right? Like, we wrote the paper on the T before there was GPT, AlphaFold 3. It's in the core. It's a computer science company, and so it's kind of distilled throughout. It's an interesting question of whether or not you use it all the time. It's certainly infused in our products. Now, do I personally use it to, summarize a meeting? Yeah. I mean, the transcription, translation, phenomenal. So there is utility for, it's a solution looking for a problem. If I have problem areas that have hard friction, right? I couldn't tell you the last time I built a folder or stored documents in a subfolder or had any naming categorization. It's a search problem. And so creating index, creating a vector store of all of that data, and then being able to find it, unbelievably efficient. So I definitely see the non-healthcare benefits of kind of the technology of just information gathering for knowledge workers, information presentation, and then workflow. But yeah, I mean, our developers certainly use generative AI all the way through, YouTube, and the cat videos is real. A lot of the work going on from text to video. So
that's great. So we did want to open the floor for questions from the audience. I'm not sure if there's mics floating around, but if you do have a question, please just raise your hand and try to project here in the front.
Hi, great talks, thank you. I was wondering, we talk about treating AI, generative AI as a intelligence and testing and retesting. For our predictive AI machine learning models, we have drift at some point. Now, is there such a phenomenon with generative AI, and how would that manifest, considering that it's continuously absorbing data?
Kathy, did you want to?
You know, I think that's a huge problem and why we need continued performance testing. Right now, the FDA has approved frozen models, although there is a new paradigm in sort of predicting how you might see your model change over time. But I think we need more tools to be able to, we monitor in real time performance degradation, and then unfortunately, which doesn't scale, have to manually go back and find, you know, what was the cause of the error and fix it. And I think we need technologies to recognize drift, either data drift, model drift, and so on, and to mitigate that, to fix it and communicate what is going on to the end user as well. So I think it's a huge problem, certainly on the analytic AI. And I think, again, recognition of when things go wrong is a very important aspect to it.
If I could just add a comment. The FDA has an approach to what some call drift, others might call improvement, in analytic AI as it is continuously retrained on new data. It's called a predetermined change control pathway, and you can find it on the internet. Interesting, we consider drift in humans a positive. We require that clinicians continually educate themselves, continuous medical education. We value learning. We think of it as a lifelong project. We don't test clinicians every time they read a new article. And I think the psychology around this technology will change when we start to see it as a useful intelligence rather than a threat, and begin to set parameters around how we continuously recertify it, but without necessarily the same kind of fear that drift now engenders. The question is the drift positive or negative?
Yeah, I would just reinforce, I mean, so we see model drift. I mean, 11% of all 2 trillion searches a day is something that Google's never seen before. Terms, words, events, 11%. And so there's an inherent need for model drift, right? It's got to evolve and shape a search experience, and so that's kind of the computer science behind it. But DevOps and kind of that operating model behind the scenes, you need to have a framework, you need to have a process in which you have a mechanism to take in those drifts, whether it be, suppose you're deploying the next generation foundation model, you need to be able to deploy it in your environment, test, measure, validate, and go. So it's a whole operations. It's 1 part technology, but it's 9-part process.
Let's shift gears. We're running low on time, so we're happy to talk after the session, but let's shift gears and do a kind of a rapid fire predictions for the future. And we've been talking about the advancements with Gen AI and specifically with large language models, and we're even seeing large language models pass the USMLE. They can pass specialty board exams. And so do you foresee a time where AI fully replaces the need for a physician, or do we think that AI will always work alongside physicians? And I think each of you brings a different kind of clinical specialty take to this question. So Faisal, we'll start with you.
Okay, so in my opinion, it would always be in combination with physicians. That's how we are developing our models. Eventually, I do foresee that down the line there will be certain tasks that AI would be so good at that it could just do on its own. In our field, in pathology, it would be very fundamental basic triage. If something is very obviously normal, a pathologist probably does not need to look at it. The models for that, very deterministic models, are already there. There are trials ongoing for primary diagnosis. So essentially, that would mean that they would have more time for more complicated diagnostic tasks down the line.
I think that there are many reasons why physicians will stay in the loop, or other clinicians too. But right now, the legal system in the United States is geared toward physician accountability. Our entire framework for controlling professional knowledge and professional behavior and the trust that engenders is around physician accountability. So ultimately, the machine is not going to be liable. It's going to be the clinician who uses it who will be liable. So the clinician needs to be part of this equation, or it won't get used.
Yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer to me. It's accountable to a human. So definitely accountable to the clinician for the points that David mentioned. I mean, workflow is king, and last time I checked, Gemini can't touch or hold a patient's hand. So there's always going to be the need for clinicians in the practice, and most importantly, in the reduction of practice of bringing these technologies to patients.
Kathy?
Yeah, I'm very happy to see the pilot in the cockpit when I get on a plane. So I think we're going to be in that mode for quite some time. I think as Faisal said, I think there are some administrative tasks that we can automate that we would be happy to not do, things that humans don't do well and don't like to do. But I still want to see a physician in the loop.
This was great. Clearly, we have a lot of consensus on this panel, from starting with being very optimistic of the future and also optimistic of a future that includes expert clinicians using AI to be even higher performing and delivering better care to our patients. For those of you who enjoyed this session, I want to encourage you to visit our Emerging Technology Zone, which is just down the path there in the Abridge room, where if you want to actually get your hands on some AI, also some augmented and extended reality tools, and even a drone, you can check it out. That room opens at noon to 4 today, and then will be open again tomorrow all day from 8 to 4. With Alec, I'd love to give a huge thanks to our panelists for today's discussion.
Thank you.